Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dear brothers, my dear sisters, what's going on? Men of Dean Dyer's podcast. How are you? It is Thursday the 15th at approximately 12:05 in the afternoon. It has been a while. Um, yeah, a lot happened this summer. Um, I went home. I got to go home for a couple weeks. Then you caught me in Uganda for a couple weeks. Ooh, subhanallah, what a great time. Just didn't really have much time to kind of plant my feet. I was in three different countries across 2 months. Then the kids and so. Oh, and then my device broke. As you know, I don't have a cell phone, but what I do have is a an iPad, and the iPad went kaput, and so that's what I was using for Instagram. And so you can't go live on Instagram on the PC. So therefore, I'm going live on YouTube now. Maybe I'll try YouTube and Facebook and see which one works best. But let's get into it. Um, so the topic today is well, there's a couple topics and they're related. Um, Disobedient daughters, obedient wives. Okay, we know that the Quran says that righteous woman will obey her husband. And so, as a man who's looking for a wife or a man who is raising a future wife, the objective is to raise and cultivate an obedient daughter. Um, I was having a talk with my kids about the nafs and about vices, right? Because they're directly connected. Controlling we were talking about fasting, and so we were talking about the importance of being able to control your desires. Okay. Um, and so that led to a discussion about, well, what are the common vices that we have, right? And it's very interesting that the common vices of men are all known to everyone. They're out in the open, and most of them are punishable by law. So sex, women, right? Um, Prostitution, punishable by law. Um, then there's addiction, right? And they're all kind of trending towards addiction. Some level of addiction, or right, because well, what is alcohol? It's an addiction. Drugs is an addiction. For many, sex is an addiction. Pornography, addiction. Um, Many of the vices of violence, many of the vices of men are somehow punishable by law, and they're all very clearly known. Like, it's very easy to look at a man, point out his addictions, and shame him for the vices that he has. But coming onto this discussion about vices, the vices of women are a lot less known, interestingly so. And they're also a lot harder to wag a finger at, to even define. And so I did a quick search on the internet, and likewise, it was very hard to find any list of common vices of women. And it's just interesting how this ambiguity exists for women. And it doesn't serve women because it makes it very easy for them to obfuscate and hide. And you really can't deal with your vices, your issues, your faults, your shortcomings, until and unless you first identify that they exist. And because the vices of women are so easy to hide and camouflage, it also creates a barrier between a woman and her vices, that she may not even identify her vice as a vice. Um, and so, in any case, we kind of went over this list, and I pulled up a very interesting list for the vices of women. So I wanted to go through all, well, not all of them, some of them with you, and maybe we can get some feedback if you guys are interested in the conversation. Okay, so the 10 habitual vices that women struggle with. Okay, the number one vice is, now this was written by a woman. Okay, number one is thinking that we know better than God. Wow, wow, wow. And it sounds a bit over the top until you really sit down and think about, you know, what it is that's happening today, right? So, irrespective of your religion, okay, we know that God has set an order for things, right? This is a very ordered world that God has created. Um, you know, each animal, each insect has its function. If you look at the human body, how we're structured. Our wounds are self-healing. We've got red blood cells, white blood cells, 10 fingers, 10 toes, 2 eyes, and 1 nose. We have roles. We have a certain structure to our body. There's a certain structure to everything that's around us. So we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a very structured and organized God. Okay. And so in the context of a family and society, society is structured around the family, and the family itself has a structure. And that structure is man at the head of the family, and the woman supporting the man, and then the woman overseeing the children. And this structure has been put in place by God Himself, and has been the bedrock of all civilizations, dating back to the beginning of recorded civilization. Yet and still, women today are seeking to overturn that structure and put themselves at the head of the family. And that includes talk about being equal to men, because there is no being equal then if you're not the same as. Okay. And so it's a false dichotomy to even talk about being equal to something that you're not the same as. Okay. And so the talk about being equal to man is in actuality a talk of being, at least putting yourself in a superior position to men, because men didn't abdicate. Men didn't tell you, we want you to be. You came to men and said, we want to be. And so by definition, you're putting yourself in authority over a man. And as men, we are benevolent. Men are benevolent. Um, it's pretty obvious, because if the average man was not benevolent, the world that we live in would simply not be possible. It would be impossible. I've been around the world, and I see in most societies, women are free to walk around at night. They're free to walk around during the day. Um, in most societies, the vast majority of societies, women do not face an immediate threat by the average man. Uh, we are benevolent beings. We don't seek violence and confrontation. I'm talking about the average man. We don't seek violence and confrontation. And likewise, we also seek to naturally protect women. Again, you go across the world and you ask a man, what his role is in society or in family, and he'll tell you. And it's almost a verbatim quote that will tell you that our function is to protect and to provide. We all know this. There's no question to the average man that this is our role and our function. Now, if you ask the average woman what her role and function is, you're going to get a lot more variation and a lot more obfuscation and a lot more ambiguity, because women in general don't seem to know what their role and function is in society. And it's increasing as we go forward in time. And so when woman tries to overturn the order of God by putting themselves at the top, at the head of a family, in front of a man. That speaks to this vice that we just read, we just touched on here, which is women thinking that we know better than God. And so, as crazy as it sounds, it's more common than it seems. Okay? And so, with that, I can understand this is obviously written by a Western woman, an American woman, and that is trending to be very true. You know, when you think that you know better than God by turning God's order upside down and putting yourself at the head of a family in front of a man. Okay, so let's look at the second one. Delayed obedience. Now, this is an interesting one. This is a very interesting one. How often do we know that God is asking us to do something and yet still we delay our obedience? Okay, so delay obedience. That is, well, what that means is that you're immediately disobedient, right? If God wants you to do something and God has a timing for it, and you say, no, I'll do it later. You're not doing it now. Okay. So again, it's this idea of woman somehow supplanting the the directions, the advice, and the guidance of God. Okay, so it's very related to the first one. Okay, so the first one, so thinking that you know better than God. This is internalized disobedience, is a resistance to doing what God has instructed you to do, right? Thinking that you know better than God, right? This is internal resistance to the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then number two is delayed disobedience or delayed obedience. Okay, it's a function of this same idea that there's God's will and then somehow there's your will, and your will is somehow tantamount to God's will. It's an insane thing to think about. Okay, but God says now and you say later. you know Okay, so number one and two, in terms of the common vices of women as written by a woman, are quite related. Then number three is the tolerance of sin. Wow. Again, same general theme, right? Because this is saying that women tolerate what God finds intolerable, which is a woman putting her judgment above the judgment of God. And again, we look at today's society in the West and this same culture that is now being pushed worldwide. Specifically, we're talking about the tolerance of this LGBT satanic foolishness. Women tolerate this. They tolerate, women being quote unquote equal to men. They tolerate what God finds intolerable. They make excuses for what God finds inexcusable. Again, this is a function of the female putting herself before the will of God. So 1, 2, and 3, inexorably linked. This idea of arrogance really is what it is. And so I don't want to go down the entire list, but I just want to look at these top three. And I want to look at this idea of female arrogance, a woman thinking that, or girl thinking that she knows better than God, that somehow her opinion is above the guidance, the direction, obedience to God. And let's look at the relationship between gratitude and obedience. Because we want to marry obedient wives. and we want to cultivate obedient daughters. How does that relate to gratitude? And I know intuitively that they are linked. They are linked at the hip. You cannot, especially as it pertains to the relationship between a man and a woman. So we know that there's a hadith that says that the Prophet Muhammad looked into the hellfire, and he saw that most of the inhabitants of hell were women. Now I'm not quoting. Actually, I'll tell you what. Let me pull up this hadith so I hellfire, women, hadith. Okay. I was shown the hellfire. Hadith. Okay, here we go. This is narrated by Ibn Abbas. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, I was shown the hellfire, and that the majority of its dwellers were women who were ungrateful. Ungrateful. Okay, so again, I want to explore the link between disobedience and ungratefulness. Now we can see already just with that statement that there's a very, very strong link between ungratefulness and disobedience. I was asked, do they disbelieve in Allah? Now this is an interesting question, because we know that the one sin that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not forgive is shirk. Okay? Making partners with Allah, inherently a disbelief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that question makes sense, right? It's a very, very rational question. Okay, so it was asked, do these women who are in hell, do they disbelieve in Allah? Or are they ungrateful to Allah? He replied, they are ungrateful to their husbands and are ungrateful for the favors and the good, the charitable deeds done to them. If you have always been good, benevolent to one of them, and then she sees something that in you, not to her liking, she will say, I have never received any good from you. Subhanallah. Astaghfirullah. Man. So let's look at this link between being ungrateful and being disobedient, right? So if somebody gives you something, right, and says, listen, I don't need you to pay this back to me. I just need you to tell me thank you. That's all. That's all. I'll give you $1,000, right? And the only thing that I require of this $1,000 is that you just tell me thank you. And then you refuse to thank that person. You take the money and you refuse to thank that person. Now, this is the height of ingratitude, right? And it's also very disrespectful, right? So there's this connection between disobedience, disrespect, and lack of gratitude, right? That if you're really grateful to that person, and the only thing they ask you to do is thank them, then of course you would thank them, right? But if you refuse to thank them, you are by definition ungrateful, by definition disrespectful. by definition, disobedient. Hmm. So, how do you cultivate an obedient daughter? How do you cultivate a woman to be obedient to her husband as a father? Well, in order for her to be obedient to you as a father, you have to enforce standards, right? In other words, if you have no standard, which is, you can just do whatever, and I'm going to give you acceptance and love, um, no problem. It's impossible to cultivate obedience, right? Because the default in this dunya is disobedience. And I don't speak about the fitra of a woman, because the fitra of a woman is to submit, to be in a state of submission to God. But once women come into this world, particularly in the West, but increasingly everywhere else, through all these movies, Disney, hitting these kids, hitting these young girls very young, and invoking in them a spirit of disobedience, particularly to their fathers. And why is that? Why, if you look at all these Disney movies, it's always a young girl, disobeying her father. And this is her, you know, entrance into the next stage of her life, her development, womanhood. This is freedom. This is the aspirational thing. And the aspirational thing comes at the sacrifice of the relationship with her father. And eventually she goes on her adventure. She does some great and good thing, and eventually the father has to acquiesce to the daughter. Right? This is the theme. So this idea that daughters have to rebel against their fathers is being um, inserted into the minds of our daughters. And so when I say the default is for girls to disobey their fathers, the default is for girls to disrespect their fathers, the default is for girls to be ungrateful to their fathers through disobedience, um, then the question becomes how to counter this. Well, the only way to counter it is to hold tight to the standards that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set, because that's the only way to cultivate a spirit of obedience in our daughters, is by having a standard. If you have no standard, then there's nothing to obey. And but what I see is that many men, and probably it's a reaction to the environment, are not setting high standards for their daughters, because when you set a high standard, it invites this conflict between these two cultures. There's the culture of God, and there's the culture of the world, and these two things are opposite. And so when you hold a standard for your daughter and say, I'm not going to allow you to do this, knowing that she wants to do it, knowing that the world supports her desire to do it, then you're inviting a conflict between you and your daughter. you know but if you're trying to raise a daughter who is going to be obedient to her husband and therefore a righteous woman, we don't really have a choice. As fathers, we don't really have a choice. And so you simply have to step up to the plate, and you have to hold up God's standard. Okay? Otherwise, you can't expect your daughter to be obedient if you don't give her a standard to adhere to. SubhanAllah, it's not easy. It's not easy. But this is exactly why obedient wives are few and far between, right? It's very hard to find a woman who understands, and not only understands, but wants to obey you as her husband. You know, it's very hard to find a woman who strives to be righteous, because who doesn't, cherry pick Now, again, I'm not talking about imperfection. I'm not talking about making mistakes. I'm talking about willfully and consistently disobeying God, knowing that you're disobeying God, understanding the repercussions of disobeying God, but somehow thinking that you are immune to punishment, or that the punishment is not real, or that whatever the punishment is, well, I'll just deal with it later. This level of arrogance. It's very hard to find women who don't have that, or that has not been cultivated in them and is simply a time bomb. And so, as a man, if you're looking for a wife, and I've mentioned this before and I've spoken on this before, it is critical to make sure that one of the very first conversations that you have with your prospective wife is about her obedience to you, and to not mince words about the importance of her being obedient to you. And aside from her telling you that she will be obedient to you, that she not only will be obedient, but wants to be obedient, that longs to be obedient to you as her husband, aside from her giving you this assurance with her mouth, this is why you need to also know her father. This is why you have to speak with her father and understand how he raised her, the standards that he had for her growing up, and if she met these standards as she was growing up. Because disobedient daughters don't magically turn into obedient wives. Okay? So you have to sit down with the dad and ask him, was she an obedient daughter to you? And if she did disobey you, how often did she disobey you? And if she grew up constantly disobeying her father, there's a very good chance that even if she says that she wants to be obedient to you, there's a very good chance that you're dealing with a time bomb. Now there are exceptions to every rule, but the rule is still the rule. And so make sure, if you're looking to get married, that you have a serious conversation with her about obedience. It's great to talk to her about, her faith and how she adheres to the faith, and if she's covering, she's praying, she's fasting. But it's also very easy, especially if the sister's from a Muslim country, that these are simply tenets of the culture. They're tenets of the religion, but there also could be just part of the culture, and she adheres to the culture without going to the deeper level of obedience to God. She could just be wearing her hijab because this is what everybody does. And on the outside, to you, you look at it as a man and say, "Oh, mashallah, she's covering." And she's covering because she sees the value in modesty. But maybe that's not why she's covering. Maybe she's covering because she's always covered. And it's the culture, and you, as a man who's looking for a wife, who's looking for a righteous wife, you want to make sure that it is out of submission to God, not compliance with society or compliance with culture. That there has to be a very deep sense of obedience to God, and obedience to God, that is the engine of all of these outward manifestations of faith. That she's not fasting just because she's been fasting since she was a kid, and this is just kind of what she does. Okay. And so that doesn't necessarily come with a simple conversation about adhering to the tenets of Islam. It comes to a deeper conversation with her about the importance of obedience and her desire to be obedient. And then on top of that, a deeper conversation with her father about, first of all, the standards that he used when he raised her. If he held her to a high standard and therefore required obedience from her, and if she responded to those standards with obedience on a consistent level. And I think if you engage in these conversations, you will stand a much higher chance of finding that needle in the haystack, that righteous wife who will obey her husband, inshallah wa ta'ala. I think I'm going to stop there for today. If you have any comments or questions, put them in the comments section. Or if you want, you can also, if you watch the video later, you want to comment or ask a question later on, or even engage in the discussion, you can jump on the next live. I will try to remain consistent to this date and time, so we can have some kind of regularity. If you are a practicing Muslim and you are looking for a spouse, you can reach me directly at hearthunter at Men of Deen. You can reach me here on YouTube. You can also reach me via Instagram at hearthunter. Instagram is Men of Deen Official. Okay. Otherwise, I will look forward to your comments, and see you next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.